So we call these evenings more questions than answers. And so the obvious question to kind of really kick us off is, what questions are you grappling with at the moment, Selina?
I mean, I think like I have so many questions I'm grappling with. So trying to choose one or two is quite the challenge. Um, and I have some new ones since we initially spoke about this as well. So I think one of my
Fantastic.
questions at the moment is, I guess, wrestling with, what the church is and what the church is called to be in the world at a time like this.
Mm,
And particularly because I think I find myself as somebody who's like raised as a Christian and has lots of hopeful ideas about the church and what it can do and be in the world. But also I'm quite a realist. I'm quite willing to call a spade when it comes to where the church struggles and is just abysmally failing sometimes to live up to some of the beautiful stories that we tell ourselves about what it is to be Christian or what it is to be the church. So I kind of am caught in this realism and this kind of wanting to be more hopeful as well about what is possible.
mm,
um so I'm really wrestling with that question about what does it mean for us to be a Christians, to be part of the church, and to work alongside a community and communities which are really struggling, where there are so many people with so many needs, and lots of people of goodwill who are not Christians at all, who are doing incredible things. And how do we partner
mm.
and let go of some of the ideas that say we have to be the ones who are leading in this? What does it mean to just be a human being who is being transformed by God in in a community context? So that's one of my big questions at the moment.
Excellent. I'm interested in a line that you threw in there, which is all about we almost need to be seen to be leading. Where do you
Mm,
think that comes from? Why? Because I resonate with that as I've watched people respond to COVID. That kind of thing of, oh, it's the church is right at the front of this, and it seems a bit strange, really. And I'm just interested. Where do you think that kind of impulse and that desire to be front and
mm.
center comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it comes from a good place sometimes. I think there's a real desire to to recognize that there is a real need for leadership. There's a real need for take having innovative ideas about how to bring transformation in communities. There's a need for, for being active and for taking on the responsibility of seeing positive changes made. And so that kind of pragmatic impulse, coupled with a theology around being chosen people, around being called to be witnesses of God in the world. Like I think all of it kind of combines into this sense of we need to have a very special role in the world in terms of mission. And I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think, there were so many beautiful um, aspects of the gospel story. There's so many beautiful elements of what Jesus represents, and what followers of Jesus are called to be. But I think sometimes we overemphasize the Christian aspect and underplay the human aspect. That actually we're all human beings. Actually, we're all born as human beings, and there's so much commonality between us. So many people have such incredible motivations for doing good that are not faith-based motivations, but they're doing amazing things nonetheless. And can we recognize that as something good and
Mm,
even something God-given, even though Jesus' name might not be on it, or people
mm,
might not consider themselves to be Christians? And is it okay for us to accept that and to appreciate that? And not to think that we're having to prove that we're even better than people of other faiths or better than people of no faith. Can we hold our humanity and our Christianity closer together?
Do you think? Do you sense that any of that comes from almost an insecurity? That you kind of feel like you have to push your own kind of identity forward,
Mm.
rather than kind of just being secure in yourself and kind of just in some ways it doesn't matter who we're partnering with because we're kind of secure. Do you sense that there's any insecurity around that?
I think that might be true for some, although I don't imagine people who feel like that would call it insecurity. I think they'd probably say, um, we're called to be to be something in particular, to be leaders, to be, to transform the world, to be representing something very special. And I think there's probably a little bit of insecurity about what that really looks like. And I think if a lot of Christians maybe were honest with themselves, they would also wrestle with some of these questions about how can we say we're a holy community and yet so much of what we display is no different to what's in the world,
Mm,
to use kind of
mm,
old school dualistic language where you kind of have the church and the world over here. I think if we were honest, we'd find those questions quite disturbing.
yeah.
We have amazing narratives, powerful narratives about the way that God's changed us, transformed us, but so often we struggle with exactly the same issues as people who have not become Christians or as organizations that don't call themselves Christian. So I think it's a real struggle of identity. What does it really mean for us to say we've met Jesus or Jesus has met us?
Uh-huh.
What does it really mean for us to say we're full of the Spirit if on the outside things can look pretty similar to people who don't have that faith? So I think some of that kind of wrestling is going on subconsciously, maybe. And so
Mm,
the need to kind of push forward this kind of we are the great people is probably more of an aspirational declaration than it is reflecting what's really going on.
mm. You've already alluded to things at the moment, but there seems to be in how you're talking a real quest for authenticity,
Mm,
the kind of what it means to be authentic church.
yes.
I'm just give us a few signposts of what you
Mm,
think that looks like, and not in a kind of idealistic thing, but actually warts and all. What does it mean to authentically be the church?
yeah. I mean, I think we probably complicate this a little bit more than we need to. I always try to hold this together in the simplicity of Jesus saying that the world is going to know that you're my disciples because of the way that you love one another. And this kind of gets lost in all of the other things that we think represent Christianity to the world. Being really successful at mission is one of the things that we probably imagine should come first. Exhibiting like particular kinds of perfection or morality, we think is that's probably first. Um, and all other things that we kind of imagine having lots of power, lots of institutional power and lots of influence is what Christians should be in the world. But actually Jesus is very simple about this,
Mm,
that what the world really really needs is people who love one another truthfully and honestly and openly, who are committed to one another's flourishing before anything else.
mm,
That's the thing that I think shines more brightly than anything else. I mean, if we want to see success, we can look at huge corporations who set up lots and lots of businesses and create lots of jobs. If you want to see, this kind of like real power, there's all kinds of things that model that in the world. But love is not something we see models.
mm,
It's not something that we really see. If we're lucky, we experience it in our family settings or with our friends or but I think a lot of people are desperate for love, so desperate for love.
mm,
And some of the resistance people feel to the church, I think, is a resistance to institutions,
mm,
to the power and the abuses of power and the control that institutions represent for so many people. But no, but love is something everybody's looking for, everybody's desiring this. And I think if we led with that determination, that like come what may, whatever theological disagreements we have, whatever doctrinal differences we might have, whatever we're struggling to get our heads around in terms of the church, its mission and anything else,
mm,
if we commit to love, that's something that is just incomparable
mm,
in terms of the driving agenda of so many other bodies of people. And I don't think we believe the words of Jesus that love is really the thing that
mm,
shines brightest of all, but
mm.
it seems to be the thing that everybody's most desperate for.
I'm struck by your job title, tutor and lecturer in political theology, and you spent the last 3 or 4 minutes talking about love, and actually talking about the abuses of institutional power, which is in some ways kind of feels almost at odds with your job title. So
Mm,
just talk to us when you use the language of political theology, that when you use that title, what's how are you using it? How are you even using the what does politics mean? What and
yeah,
how
yeah,
does it
yeah.
relate to theology?
Yeah, I really struggle with my title. That's why I chuckled when you were announcing it, because I think political theology historically has often been very much focused on government, you know, government policy, the activities of the state, what is godly government, and all these big questions that Augustine and Aquinas are wrestling with in the kind of in their work. And I think I guess I learned politics through community organizing. So my thinking about what is political is a lot broader than that.
Mm,
It's actually about all the ways in which we participate or not
mm,
in public life. It's all the ways in which we have power within our communities
mm,
to have a say on what's happening. It's all the ways in which we associate with other people and influence what's happening, even in a kind of at the smallest level of housing associations, and the kind of small p politics stuff I think is so significant.
mm,
And in that way, all of us are political in some sense, because even if we don't engage, our absence is political. It's having an impact on public life. Um, so I think of politics in that sense. And so a lot of the teaching I do is less about church and state and government policy. Although we talk about that stuff, it's about what does it mean for Jesus to talk about coming to set the oppressed free? What does liberation mean? I do a lot of liberation theology. I love thinking about the gospel in holistic terms.
uh-huh,
So really broadening the imagination about what the gospel is about, and this incredible transformational work of Jesus in the world, which we often reduce so much to the spiritual, and forget that there's this holistic message of transformation of the whole of creation. And I love that prayer that Carmel gave at the beginning, which she talked about the earth, like honoring the earth, honoring the oneness of all of life. Like, this is the beauty of this incredible good news, that all of life is being made new and restored, not just individual people, not just our spiritual life, but all of life, our political life, everything about the choices we make, our culture, our social relationships.
mm,
So I think opening all of that up to the work of God is just so crucial. And looking for signs of that transformation in all areas of life, I think is just, I mean, it's incredible, really. And I didn't grow up with this. I grew up with a very individualized understanding of the gospel.
mm,
I grew up with you hear the message at church, you put your hand up, you say the prayer, and now you're a Christian. And that got really boring by the time I was 18. I was like, is this it?
yeah, yeah,
And we just basically trying to play the soft music at the right time and get people to put their hands up at the right time, and trying to think of really cool small group themes for the next 80 years or whatever of my life.
yeah,
And I remember being in a class where my lecturer David Harvey was talking about the gospel in this whole cosmic sense, the whole of creation being restored. And I thought, that's something I could get behind.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
something that I could spend my whole life living for this. And
mm,
it was like a moment of mind conversion as well as heart conversion.
yeah. There's clearly some steps on the way of
Mm,
going from that person, and I, if I've got you right, kind of brought up more in an evangelical,
yeah,
individualized context.
Pentecostal.
Excellent, kind of moving through, but you haven't lost. Do you think you've lost some of that, or how do you view the kind of more holistic kind of way of reading the world and reading faith? How do you view that in the light of that?
Mm, it's
Is
a
it
good
disconnected?
question. It's a really good question, because I think I'm on an ongoing journey with this. So I'm almost reluctant to say something now that I'm going to be like, in a week's time, actually, no, Selena, that's not right. And now it's on YouTube.
Yeah, well,
But
yeah, we won't tell anybody, Selena. You're fine with us, honestly.
but this is the thing, like, you have to be okay with evolving, don't you, as a thinker?
Yes.
You have to be okay with
Yeah.
saying something one week and then thinking, actually, no, Selena, that's not quite right. Um, but I mean, I think I'm evolving in this, because I still consider myself a Christian. I know that I've encountered God through Jesus,
Mm,
and that is like undeniable.
mm,
Um, And so part of me is quite keen to share that with people, because I think that where people are desiring to have a deep spirituality and are desiring to meet God.
Mm.
I think, well, that's how I've met God. If I would probably was of a different faith, I would have probably pointed them somewhere else.
Yeah.
But this is what I know. So I'm quite keen to share that with people
Yeah.
who are interested and who are looking for a kind of space in which to explore their spirituality.
Uh-huh.
But I'm also quite aware that churches are very difficult places. So I really struggle with, and then where do I point them afterwards?
Mm.
How do I help them then to find a space where they might flourish and grow? Because
Mm.
I myself struggle so much with finding a space where I can really grow in faith.
Mm.
Um, so I think I'm kind of in that place of recognizing that need, that desire for conversion. But
Mm.
I also think it's not just about putting your hand up and saying, I want to be a Christian now. I've met people who are not Christian and people of other faiths who display to me the ways of Jesus more beautifully than lots of Christians I've met. So it's like, what do you do with that? Do you
Yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
If I in my old church, they would say, they're not Christian and pontificate about where they're going to spend eternity because they haven't necessarily put their hand up and said a prayer, but they're embodying something of the beauty of Jesus in a way that's undeniable, over people who have put their hand up and said, I want to be a Christian, and are not in any way embodying the beautiful traits of Jesus. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally get that. I guess my background Salvation Army, but in my late teens, early 20s, well, throughout my 20s, very much involved in the kind of charismatic movement. I'm very aware of what the Spirit was doing at the time. And,
Mm,
I look back and to kind of say that wasn't the Spirit, it was something else, feels like, well, you can't do that because
yes.
I know that there were some really real things going on.
Mm, mm,
And now having a more, I guess, a more nuanced, probably a more holistic look, it's like trying to rework the understanding of what the Spirit is doing.
yes. Yeah.
And I find that really interesting. You've mentioned a few times, particularly early on, around issues of power, and you seem to be suggesting that the church can often be obsessed is too strong, and that's not your language, but interested in expressing power. And when you were talking about it, you seem to be kind of like uneasy about that. Tell us, what do you think about power when that word is used? And I hate to label the point, you are a political theologian, so in some ways you have to think about power at some point. What kind of view? How do you see power, and how do you see the church could be using power in different ways?
Mm. I mean, I think power is unavoidable, and particularly in institutions. And this is the challenge of it. Is often, I think, with institutions, you have lots of, even the people themselves might have really great ambitions of how they want to use power, but the institution has a life of its own and
Mm.
forces you to take on particular positions, which inevitably mean you have power. So
Mm.
it's always fascinating to me meeting people who you think are super powerful, bishops, in the Church of England, for example, or leaders of particular organizations who, when you meet them, say, oh, I just don't have the power to do anything about this. And it's like, well, if you don't have the power, then God help the rest of us. But there's a kind of power that is almost invisible to them because they're in these positions.
Yeah.
And but then also the institution has a set of expectations now that it's just embedded in the culture. It's embedded in the machine and how it works. So a person might have the best intentions and get drawn into this machine that's taking on a life of its own. So this is a very difficult thing to hold power well when you're part of a machine that exists with hierarchies, that perpetuates certain kinds of domination, even if the people in it don't want it to be like that. It's almost inevitable. When you have huge amounts of resources and you have a hierarchy, you're going to have power and power inequalities and the potential for abuses of power. So it's almost inevitable. But I think for Christians, for churches, again, power can differ quite a lot depending on which kind of church you're in. and the perception of power can. So I think about, my Pentecostal church locally had a certain amount of power on its street in the local community, didn't have a lot of power beyond that, definitely didn't have national power.
Mm,
Church of England has bishops in the House of Lords. The archbishops marry the royal family when they have a wedding. There's a whole level of influence that the Pentecostals have never even are nowhere near having. But I think it's probably for the best. I was thinking about this today about how power gives opportunities and also so much risk for compromise. How can you be part of an establishment and also try to speak prophetically to that establishment when you're so embedded in it? How do you resist when you're dependent upon it to a certain extent for your very existence? It is very, very difficult to resist, to challenge when your fate is kind of bound to a particular machine or structure. So it's not easy, and I think individuals really have to be willing to lose everything in order to stand up for what matters.
mm,
You can't kind of cozy up to the power brokers and at the same time claim to want to be helping the marginalized. It's kind of almost impossible. And I think this is what Jesus, right, shows us this.
mm,
Like Jesus makes a very clear choice that he's not here to cozy up to the power structures. He's here to agitate them because the kingdom is at hand and to call them to repentance. And they're so angry and they can't stand Jesus to the point where they plot to kill him and eventually do. So much is he choosing to side with a new order, a new way of being.
mm,
The religious and political establishment can't allow him to continue to do what he's doing because it's so disruptive. And yet we kind of take this Jesus and domesticate him and we put him in robes and put a really fancy mitre on his head and say, oh, this is our King Jesus. We sit him in a cathedral with a really, really tall chair and say, this is our King Jesus. And it's like, Jesus is not wearing that.
mm.
And he's definitely not sitting in a fancy chair in a cathedral. He's somewhere at the back, you know, probably barefoot and sitting on the floor with some people around the back of the side and just talking to them and listening to them. And Howard Thurman has this beautiful quote in his book Jesus and the Disinherited where he says, we shouldn't be deceived by the fact that Christianity, this is my paraphrase, he said, we shouldn't be deceived by the fact that Christianity now looks like a religion of the powerful and the elite. Because Jesus is very clear that this is not what he's interested in doing. Like he spends his time with the people on the edges, the people who nobody wants to speak to. He has offered us a faith of the oppressed people. And I often read that and think, wow, like we can so easily imagine that in Jesus's mind, he imagined the thing that we have now and called church, a huge institution with lots of gold on the walls and lots of money and land and fancy buildings. And Howard Thurman's like, don't be deceived by this. Don't think this is what Christianity is really about. Because it's so easy for that to happen, particularly in places like the UK where we have our beautiful cathedrals and we can get so caught up in the trappings and lose the most beautiful aspect of this whole faith that we have.
You used a phrase, and I'll paraphrase you just as you've managed to paraphrase it. I thought you were going to be able to quote it. I was going to be like, that's impressive.
Next time, Andrew, next time.
But you used a phrase about disruption. And I really, when you said it, it really kind of resonated with me. Partly because I guess I'm a bit of a subversive. I get attracted by subversives. I like that kind of stuff. What about disrupting power in the world? How might we as individuals? Lots of people on this call are embedded in their neighborhoods, doing work in their neighborhoods, often some of those neighborhoods that are being discarded in some ways by the power structures. How can we start to what does that disruption, how do you imagine that disruption, and what does it look like, and what does it feel like, and how do we kind of cultivate spaces of disruption?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that disrupting power takes power. So
Yeah.
you need to have power to disrupt power. And this is partly why I loved organizing. I would always love it because it was a space in which we got to practice disrupting.
Yeah.
with the unlikely people. Like organizing is not, you know, with all the people who've gone to the best universities and they've got the professional jobs. It's just like everyday people,
Mm.
the kind of people that I grew up with on my street who, you know, might have gone to school or left school quite early to go to work. Normal working class communities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, like building power together because they recognize that if you want to take on power, you've got to build some power.
Mm.
And I think all the ways in which that can happen are so important. And it's sometimes it's the subtle ways, it's the subtle things.
Mm.
I think about my mum often, who represented to me a kind of subversive power, though she probably would laugh if she ever heard me talk about her like this. But she's somebody who, when we were growing up, was always disrupting kinds of power in subtle ways,
Mm.
particularly things like isolation. Isolation is a strong power, and the ways in which people imagine themselves to be alone, to imagine that no one cares for them, that can be a very powerful thing in a person's mind in a community. And there's all kinds of ways in which I watch my mom disrupt those powers in her interactions with people, in her there was a lady across the road from us who lived with her husband who was alcoholic, and he'd spend all their money on drink, and she didn't have any for food, and she would come to our house to ask for money from my mom, and my mom would always give her money, and I used to say, Mom, I wanted money for ice cream. I was only a kid then. And you said no, Mom, but now she's come for money, and you know she's not going to give it back to you, Mom. You know she's not going to get it back. And she always used to say to me, like, if you ever have something that somebody needs and you can give it to them, just give it to them. And she created an effect where this woman who was living in such difficult circumstances experienced something of love and hope just through that small acts of kindness and generosity. And that was the disruption of power then, because there's all kinds of powers out working in that situation. There's the husband who's an alcoholic, who's suffering with addiction. There's the children who are growing up with some domestic abuse around them. There's the woman dealing with the abuse she's living with and the financial pressures of that whole situation. And little acts disrupt that. And then I imagine what could have happened if there was an organizing a campaign around this, around, you know, addiction, care, family life. What would it have meant if she was getting paid a living wage? And all these little things then come into play, because you realize there's also structures, not just the individual interactions going on. So I think there's all kinds of ways in which that can happen. But I think that determination to say we're not going to leave things as they are is where the disruption begins.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I really like that, because in some ways you're bringing together kind of mercy, justice, discipleship, even all into conversation with one
Mm,
another. Often things that we try to polarize and
yeah,
say we should all be about justice or we should all be about mercy. Actually, you're beginning to bring in love and power. You
yeah.
almost going back to kind of where we started it. Just
Mm,
one last area that when we talked a little bit last week about some of the questions that you had. And I hope you don't mind us going there, but you talked a little bit about white supremacy and some of the discussions around white supremacy. And yeah, I just that was clearly a question that was agitating you at the time. Just interested how you would articulate some of the questions around that, which
mm,
is clearly a big subject that we've reflected on probably every time we've met in the more questions and answers in some way or other. I'm interested in your take on that.
mm. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of hot topic now, particularly in the
Mm.
news and now with Meghan Markle and all of that stuff,
Of course.
and questions about, you know, what does it mean to be British, and how do we find a definition for what it is to be British that's not depending upon a history of colonialism and imperialism and white power around the world. And that I think is the big question. It's
Mm.
like, you know, how do we just get over this idea about race? Stuart Hall, I've been reading recently, and he was a scholar in Birmingham, Jamaican heritage. He writes incredibly on culture, these ideas of culture, and I was reading an essay he presented at Harvard on I think it's like ethnicity was one he did, another one on culture, another one on nation, and this idea of what makes us who we are and how these ideas are ever evolving. These ideas of identity are ever evolving. So it left me with a lot of hope because I thought, well, if we've evolved to this point and we all begin to accept that this is not how we want to carry on, then what does it mean to reimagine what it means to be British, to be English? You know, what does it, and how do we reimagine that in ways that are not bound in the categorizing of people according to race? So that's not the only option. But it feels like whenever there's a conversation about Englishness or Britishness, it has to center around whiteness, and not on the other aspects of what it might mean for us to be raised within this culture, or so I kind of am interested in that, and how we reimagine. Particularly, we have an opportunity with Brexit
Mm,
to ask ourselves these questions.
mm,
And I mean, I know Anthony Reddy's incredible work has already given us this critique of the whole Brexit process and the ways
mm,
in which these narratives about, harking back to the golden days of the British Empire and Britain's global reach, all of that's being kind of drawn on to
mm,
promote this English nationalism that's built around whiteness.
mm,
But I think, how do we just get rid of this? What does it take for us to just accept that some of the history of this nation has does not have to be the future? And I don't even know where you go to
yeah,
debate this or
yeah.
to explore it, but it feels as if we have opportunities to grow and to move forward, and yet whenever we do, we don't.